The night split open with a scream that shattered the street's silence. Emma said, "Why would you do this to me?" Her voice trembled under years of suppression. Streetlights flickered as she staggered back, breath ragged, heart pounding. John stood opposite, torn between shame and stubbornness. He said, "It wasn't supposed to be like this, Emma." His voice cracked, nearly lost to the night. Her tear-filled eyes demanded answers he couldn't give. She whispered, "All those years of silence, and now this?" Her fists clenched as John stepped closer, shadows merging. This was no argument. It was the breaking of chains, her silence finally erupting into rage. The air remained heavy as Emma walked away, her body trembling with each step, and she whispered, "This isn't how I imagined my strength would come." The city around her felt empty, each window a silent spectator to her unraveling. Her shoes splashed through shallow puddles, as though every step tried to drown her. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart beat like a trapped bird. The memories of being told she wasn't enough returned sharply, voices of her family whispering judgments in her mind. She said, "I won't disappear, not this time." The night seemed colder, her breath sharp, but something stirred within her chest, a quiet rage that felt almost like power. Her reflection in a rain-soaked window stared back, eyes swollen but defiant, and for the first time, she didn't look away. Emma sat on a rusted bench beneath a flickering street lamp, her breath fogging in the cold air, and she whispered, "Every word they ever said still cuts." She closed her eyes, hearing echoes of her father's voice, the harsh tone of disappointment. She clenched her fists tighter on her knees, rocking slightly forward as though bracing herself. She said, "But I'm still here, still breathing." A cat darted past the shadows, reminding her that life continued around her even when she felt frozen. She inhaled sharply, lifting her chin, and the thought struck her that maybe pain wasn't meant to erase her, but to carve her into something unbreakable. The distant rumble of traffic echoed like thunder as Emma rose from the bench, spine straightening with a slow defiance, and she muttered, "I've been silent too long." She stepped forward, rainwater dripping from her jacket, each step firmer than the last. The sting of betrayal still burned, but she felt it fueling her rather than drowning her. Her thoughts tangled with old fears, but now anger sharpened them into blades of clarity. She said, "I will not let this break me." The city seemed to whisper in response, the hum of neon lights guiding her forward. Emma reached the edge of the block, where the city opened into a wider street, headlights sweeping past as if the world rushed on without her. She whispered, "Maybe this is where I begin." Her fists relaxed, her breathing steadied, and her shoulders squared for the first time in years. She remembered her colleague's blunt words earlier in the week, echoing like an anchor in her mind, "You'll stay invisible until you choose not to." She exhaled hard, and a small fire sparked inside her chest. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not even close, but it was strength, raw, jagged, and hers. The following morning, Emma sat at her cluttered desk, the hum of fluorescent lights pressing against her temples as if the world wanted her to shrink again. She muttered, "Another day to prove I exist." The office buzzed with chatter, the sharp clicks of keyboards, and the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the stale air. Her colleague, David, leaned against the partition, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of irritation and concern. David said, "You look like hell, Emma. What happened last night?" She swallowed hard, keeping her gaze on the pile of papers before her, and whispered, "Nothing worth repeating." His scoff cut through the air, a harsh reminder that silence wouldn't save her anymore. David said, "You think hiding behind those walls makes you stronger. You'll drown in there." She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to meet his eyes, anger flickering faintly in hers. The sting of betrayal from John still haunted her chest, but David's bluntness felt like a mirror she couldn't ignore. She whispered, "Maybe drowning is easier." His expression softened slightly, and for a fleeting moment, the room fell quiet. The hum of machines returned, reminding her that the world wouldn't pause for her pain. Her thoughts circled back, pulling her deeper into conflict, the reminder that she had to rise or be erased forever. Emma sat in the crowded break room, the noise of laughter and idle conversations echoing around her, as though she was invisible. She stirred her coffee mechanically, her reflection distorted in the dark liquid. Across the room, two co-workers whispered, their eyes darting toward her, their judgment thinly veiled. She muttered to herself, "They never see me? Not really." David entered with his usual unbothered stride, grabbing a cup with one hand, and without looking at her he said, "If you keep acting like a ghost, don't complain when people treat you like one." She flinched at his words, her hands tightening around the cup until it nearly cracked. She whispered, "You think I don't try?" His eyes finally met hers, piercing, unrelenting, and his voice low. David said trying isn't the same as fighting. His honesty landed heavy, cruel but true, and she felt heat rising in her chest. The room seemed to spin with noise, but her focus narrowed to the truth he laid before her. She said, "What if I fail?" His lips curled into a smirk without humor, and he muttered, "Then at least you'll fail standing." The words cut her, but they left a spark she couldn't ignore. Later that afternoon, Emma stood by the tall windows overlooking the city, the sky streaked with gray clouds threatening rain. She pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the cold seep into her skin as though it wanted to remind her of her fragility. She said softly, "How long do I keep hiding?" The reflection staring back looked worn, tired, yet strangely alive in its cracks. David approached again, voice carrying that familiar bite. David said, "The longer you wait, the easier it is for them to erase you completely." She turned sharply, anger flaring in her eyes, and muttered, "Maybe I want to disappear." He shook his head, stepping closer, his tone unflinching. David said, "No, you don't. You wouldn't be standing here asking questions if you did." Her throat tightened, words caught between grief and defiance. She whispered, "I don't know if I have enough left." He studied her for a long moment, then looked out the window with her, the silence more grounding than words. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, but this time she didn't wipe it away. The meeting room was stifling with tension, charts glowing from the projector while Emma sat at the far end of the table, ignored by most as voices overlapped. She scribbled notes that no one asked for, her throat tight with unspoken words. A manager dismissed her input with a casual wave, moving on as if her presence was irrelevant. She forced a brittle smile, but inside her rage coiled tighter. She thought, "How many times will I be erased before I vanish completely?" David, seated across, caught her gaze, his brow furrowed, urging her silently to speak. She said nothing, her silence louder than any words. The meeting pressed on, voices drowning her, her thoughts screaming louder than their data. She whispered under her breath, "Not this time," though the sound was lost in the shuffle. The weight of choice bore down on her chest, daring her to find her voice in a room that had never wanted to hear it. As the day ended, Emma walked out of the office into the gray drizzle, her jacket clinging to her shoulders as cold drops kissed her skin. The city roared with life, horns blaring, voices rising, but she felt alone in the storm. She said, "Maybe the world wants me invisible." Her eyes caught her reflection in a shop window, rain streaking across glass like fractured veins. For a moment, she saw not weakness, but a woman on the edge of awakening. David appeared behind her, umbrella in hand, his voice carrying softly through the rain. David said, "You're not invisible, Emma. You're just afraid to be seen." She turned, her expression unreadable, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. The rain fell harder, blurring the lights of the street, but her eyes held a flicker of something she had buried long ago, rage turning into defiance. Emma sat at her desk staring blankly at the glowing computer screen, her fingers hovering above the keys as though chained by invisible weights. The hum of office machines gnawed at her focus, each sound magnified against her frayed nerves. She whispered, "How many times will I watch myself disappear?" David appeared at her side, resting his hand on the back of her chair, his voice sharp but steady. David said, "You're not disappearing, Emma. You're letting them erase you." Her throat tightened as the words struck her harder than expected. She looked at him, eyes heavy with sleeplessness, and muttered, "And what if I don't know how to stop them?" He leaned in closer, his tone unwavering, his presence grounding. David said, "Start by opening your mouth. Stop letting fear write your story." Her pulse quickened, memories of ridicule surfacing like claws. She clenched her jaw, whispering, "Every time I tried, they reminded me I was nothing." The sting of the truth burned deeper than she wanted to admit. David's gaze held steady, his silence almost louder than his words. The room seemed to shrink around her, the pile of ignored reports screaming at her like ghosts. And in that suffocating moment, she felt her anger rising, transforming into a fire too long suppressed. The office grew quieter in the late afternoon, shadows lengthening across the walls, as Emma remained frozen at her desk, unable to type a word. She whispered, "I'm tired of being the ghost in every room." David, gathering files nearby, glanced at her, his expression unreadable yet weighted with concern. He said, "Then stop haunting yourself." She turned toward him, her lips trembling with unspoken rage, and muttered, "You don't know what it's like to fight for air in every room." He stepped closer, his tone low but firm. David said, "You think you're the only one suffocating here. The difference is I decided I'd rather choke speaking than suffocate in silence." His words pierced her chest like steel, igniting a restless ache she couldn't push away. She exhaled sharply, the paper in front of her blurring through gathering tears. Emma whispered, "I don't know if I'm ready." His reply came with brutal simplicity. David said, "No one's ever ready, you do it anyway." The truth lingered heavy, each word planting itself like a seed in soil, long neglected. Later that evening, Emma stood outside the office building, the last light of sunset bleeding into a stormy sky. She wrapped her jacket tighter around her shoulders, the chill slicing through her skin. She whispered, "Why does it feel like the world is against me?" Her voice barely reached past the noise of traffic. "Ow!" John appeared suddenly across the street, his figure emerging through the crowd like a shadow she couldn't escape. He called out, "Emma, wait!" Her chest tightened as anger surged, her steps faltering but not stopping. She muttered under her breath, "Not again." John pushed through the passers-by, desperation in his face. John said, "Please, just listen. I never meant." Her head shook violently, her voice cutting sharp through the drizzle. Emma said, "You've already taken enough from me." The traffic light changed, separating them with streaks of headlights and roaring engines. She turned away, her body trembling, rage coursing stronger than the cold. The city blurred into motion, but within her chest, a storm had found its place. Emma reached a narrow alley to catch her breath, leaning against the cold brick wall, her chest heaving with the weight of all she carried. She whispered, "I can't keep running." Her fists pressed against the wall, scraping skin raw against rough edges. David found her there moments later, his voice laced with blunt honesty. David said, "Running's easier, sure, but it won't change a damn thing." She turned to face him, anger flashing through her tear-streaked cheeks. She muttered, "What if speaking makes everything worse?" His jaw tightened as he stepped closer, his words sharp enough to cut through the rain-soaked silence. David said, "What if it makes everything better?" The question struck deeper than any order, planting itself in her chest. She dropped her gaze, whispering, "I'm not ready for the fight." He shook his head, his tone unwavering. David said, "You don't need to be ready. You just need to show up." The truth lingered in the air heavier than the storm. Emma walked home alone under the heavy rain, her footsteps echoing on the pavement as streetlights painted her path in fractured light. She whispered, "I've lived my life in silence, but silence has never protected me." The storm drenched her clothes, but she didn't flinch. Her body moved with a rhythm she hadn't known before, driven by the pulsing of rage turning into resolve. She remembered David's words, each one chiseling into her bones. "Stop letting fear write your story." For the first time, she believed she could. She clenched her fists and said to herself, "I will not be erased." The declaration was swallowed by thunder, but carried weight within her chest. The night no longer felt like a cage, but like a battlefield waiting for her first step into war. She lifted her head high, her eyes fierce despite the storm. Her silence was breaking. Emma sat in her small apartment, the walls pressing in like silent witnesses, shadows stretching under the dim glow of a single lamp. Her hair clung damp to her cheeks, her jacket still wet from the storm. She whispered, "Maybe I was never meant to be heard." The words echoed hollow, bouncing back at her as though mocking her despair. She closed her eyes, her fists pressed against her temples, her heartbeat pounding louder than the ticking clock. David's words from earlier replayed, harsh and unrelenting. "Stop letting fear write your story." She exhaled shakily, her body curling forward as the weight of betrayal from John and years of silence crushed her chest. Emma muttered, "I am breaking apart." She pulled her knees to her chest, the sound of rain outside weaving into her thoughts like a lullaby meant for ghosts. Tears welled and spilled, hot against her cold skin, leaving trails she no longer tried to hide. She whispered, "If this is what strength feels like, maybe I don't want it." The room remained indifferent, the shadows offering no comfort. She sat trembling, surrounded by silence that had once been her refuge, but now felt like a tomb. The next morning, Emma dragged herself back into the office, her shoulders heavy, her steps slow as though each one carried the weight of failure. She avoided eye contact, slipping quietly to her desk, her reflection faint in the dark monitor screen. She whispered, "Invisible again." Papers piled high stared back like silent accusations of her hesitation. David noticed from across the room, his gaze steady but unreadable, his jaw tight as though restraining his words. He approached, dropping a folder on her desk with deliberate weight. David said, "You can keep hiding, Emma, but don't pretend it doesn't hurt." She flinched, pressing her lips into a thin line. Emma muttered, "I don't know how to stop it." He leaned forward, his voice a sharp whisper only she could hear. David said, "You stop it by standing up, not sitting down." Her chest ached, the sting of truth unraveling the fragile shield she had built. Around them, the office carried on, chatter and typing indifferent to her turmoil. For a moment she felt both crushed and seen, as though the choice had always been hers, but she never wanted to admit it. Later that day, Emma found herself in the stairwell, sitting on the cold steps, the concrete walls pressing down with suffocating silence. She whispered, "I am so tired of failing." Her voice cracked, echoing softly in the empty space. Footsteps approached, and David appeared, leaning against the railing, his presence a reminder of truths she wasn't ready to face. He said, "You're not failing, Emma, you're surrendering." She glared up at him, anger flickering like a match. She muttered, "And what if I'm not strong enough to fight anymore?" His tone was blunt, almost cruel, but his eyes carried something softer. David said, "Then let your anger fight for you." Her chest tightened, his words both terrifying and liberating. She looked down at her trembling hands, whispering, "Anger is the only thing I have left." He leaned closer, his voice cutting through the heavy air. David said, "Then use it before it consumes you." Her body shook as though on the edge of breaking, yet deep inside something began to stir, a restless flame refusing to die. As the rain poured outside, Emma stood in the office restroom, staring into the cracked mirror, her reflection fractured like the life she carried. She whispered, "Who am I even fighting for?" Her hands gripped the sink, knuckles whitening as she bent closer, her breath fogging the glass. Behind her reflection, she saw the shadows of every dismissal, every laugh, every betrayal carved into her memory. Emma muttered, "I am so tired of being less than." Her shoulders shook as tears threatened, but she blinked them back, teeth clenched. David's voice echoed in her mind, harsh yet grounding. "Let your anger fight for you." She slammed her palm against the sink, the sound sharp in the tiled room, and whispered, "I can't keep breaking." For a long moment she stood frozen, face inches from her own reflection, as if daring the fractured image to fight her back. The silence was unbearable, but the fire inside her was beginning to burn against the weight of despair. That night, Emma walked through the city alone, rain pouring harder than before, drenching her clothes until they clung like second skin. Neon lights smeared in puddles at her feet, colors distorted by water and motion. She whispered, "I am still standing." The words felt foreign but powerful, each one carrying more weight than the last. She remembered every dismissal, every betrayal, every silence that had crushed her into invisibility, and yet, here she was, breathing through the storm. Her fists tightened as she whispered, "I won't be erased again." The city roared around her, horns blaring, voices echoing, rain cascading from rooftops, but she walked with a steadiness she hadn't known before. Her anger no longer felt like a burden but a shield, something raw that demanded her to rise. For the first time she felt the storm outside matching the storm within, and instead of breaking, she embraced it. She whispered again, "I am still standing," louder, daring the night to challenge her. The office was quiet after hours, only the low hum of machines filling the silence as Emma stayed behind, papers spread out like fragments of her unraveling. She whispered, "I can't keep hiding." The lights flickered faintly, shadows stretching across the walls. Her chest felt heavy, the sting of John's betrayal gnawing at her every thought. Then came the sound of footsteps, familiar, slow, deliberate. She froze, her hand tightening around her pen as John entered, his expression a mixture of guilt and urgency. John said, "Emma, please hear me out." Her pulse hammered, her body stiffening like steel ready to break. She spat, "You've already said enough." His eyes searched hers, raw and desperate. John said, "What you never knew is that I was pushed. I was told to silence you, to bury your work, to keep you small because they feared your voice." The words struck like thunder, shattering her assumptions. She stumbled back, whispering, You knew, and you stayed silent?" Her anger boiled, a storm rising with every breath. The walls seemed to close in as her truth cracked open. Her invisibility wasn't just chance, it had been designed. Emma's breath came in sharp bursts as she staggered back, her hand pressed against the desk as if to steady herself against the crashing waves of truth. She muttered, "They wanted me gone." John stepped closer, his voice shaking. John said, "I tried to resist, Emma. But I was weak, and I let them use me to keep you silent." The confession ripped through her chest, anger and heartbreak colliding until she could barely breathe. Emma whispered, "All this time, I thought I wasn't enough, but it was never about me." John's eyes glistened as though he carried every ounce of shame in the world. John said, "I should have stood by you, but I didn't, and I can't undo it." Emma straightened, her rage burning into something sharper. She said, "You didn't just fail me, you helped bury me." Her words cut like a blade, and for the first time he flinched not with pride but with guilt too heavy to hold. She realized her years of silence weren't weakness, they were survival against forces she hadn't even known were orchestrated. The silence between them pressed like iron, until Emma finally lifted her head, her voice steadier than she felt. She said, "They wanted me silent because they knew I could rise above them." John lowered his gaze, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his betrayal. He whispered, "Yes, they feared your fire." For the first time, Emma felt her rage sharpen into clarity. She muttered, "All those years, I thought my silence was my choice. It wasn't, it was theft." Her fists tightened as anger coursed through her like electricity. She stepped closer, her eyes fierce, her voice rising. Emma said, "You stood by and watched them erase me, but I am still here." John flinched as though her words struck deeper than any blow. His voice cracked as he muttered, "I don't deserve forgiveness." Emma's body trembled with fury, but her lips curved into the faintest spark of defiance. She whispered, "Forgiveness is not what you'll get, not tonight." The truth no longer crushed her, it lit her path like fire in the dark. Emma stepped past John, her movements sharp as if every step severed a chain that had bound her. She muttered, "You don't own my silence anymore." He turned, his face pale under the flickering light. John said, "Emma, please, I never wanted it to end this way." She froze, her back to him, her body trembling but unyielding. She whispered, "It ended the moment you chose their power over my voice." The words carried finality, heavy enough to shake the air between them. He reached out a hand as though to bridge the chasm, but she didn't turn. Her fists loosened slightly, her breath slower, her voice stronger. Emma said, "You wanted me small. They wanted me erased. But I am still here, louder than I've ever been." The silence that followed was no longer suffocating but liberating. For the first time in years, she felt her truth settling like armor across her shoulders. John lowered his hand, his face breaking into defeat, realizing she had chosen her own strength over his weakness. Emma stepped out into the night, the storm finally easing into a mist that clung to the air like a veil. She inhaled sharply, her chest expanding as if for the first time in years she had room to breathe. She whispered, "They wanted silence, but I found my voice in rage." The city hummed around her, neon glowing against wet streets, headlights cutting through the darkness. She remembered every insult, every dismissal, every betrayal, but instead of pain, she felt the rise of something unbreakable. She muttered, "I was not broken. I was buried, but I dug myself free." Her words carried against the night, her voice small, yet undeniable. Somewhere behind her, the office lights dimmed, but she didn't look back. She squared her shoulders, her strides deliberate, every step a declaration of survival. For the first time she wasn't running, and she wasn't hiding. She whispered one final truth into the mist, "I am still here, and they will hear me." The meeting room was full, every chair occupied, voices overlapping as charts glowed across the projection screen. Emma sat at the far end of the table, her hands clenched on the folder she carried, her heart beating like war drums inside her chest. She whispered, "Not this time." The manager began dismissing concerns, waving away ideas with a smug smile that made her blood burn. Around the table, coworkers shifted, their silence complicit. Emma inhaled sharply, her body trembling, and finally she pushed back her chair with a sound that silenced the room. David, seated nearby, looked at her with piercing eyes, as though daring her to speak. Emma said, "You will not silence me anymore." Her voice cracked at first, but it echoed louder than anything she had ever said. The manager blinked, startled, and muttered, "Emma, this isn't the time." She cut him off, her words sharp, her anger laced with clarity. Emma said, "It's past time. Years of being overlooked end here." The room froze, the weight of her defiance pressing into the air like thunder before lightning. Emma's voice grew steadier as every eye in the room fixed on her, a mix of shock, discomfort, and disbelief. She said, "You've taken my work, erased my effort, and told me my silence was professionalism." Her words cut like glass across the polished table. The manager leaned back, his lips curling in irritation, muttering, "Careful, Emma." She stood taller, fists clenched at her sides, her chest rising with every breath. Emma said, "No more careful. Careful was the cage you built for me." Gasps rippled through the room, coworkers exchanging uneasy glances, but no one spoke. David leaned forward, his eyes burning with quiet pride, his silence louder than any cheer. Emma continued, her voice steady now. "You've built a system that thrives on burying voices like mine, but I will not stay buried." The tension crackled in the air, the projector hummed the only sound as her words landed heavy, undeniable. The manager stood abruptly, his voice raised in false authority. He said, "This isn't how things are done here. Sit down before you regret it." The threat hung sharp, but Emma didn't flinch. She whispered, "I've already lived with regret." She stepped forward, her voice firm, echoing against the sterile walls. Emma said, "Every time I stayed silent, I carried your power, but tonight I carry my own." Her words hit like fire, sparking murmurs from the room. John, seated farther down, shifted uncomfortably, his guilt clear as his eyes darted away from hers. Emma turned, her glare cutting through him like a blade. She said, "And you, John, you chose silence too." He lowered his gaze, ashamed, unable to respond. David's eyes flickered with approval, his smirk almost proud. The room's air felt thick, suffocating, yet Emma's voice cut through like thunder cracking open the sky. Emma's chest heaved as the silence dragged on, the weight of her defiance filling every corner of the room. She whispered, "I refuse to be invisible anymore." The words rolled out like a vow, unshakable, undeniable. Her colleagues shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but captivated, as though seeing her for the first time. The manager slammed his hand on the table, barking, "Enough!" But the sound only underscored her power. Emma's voice rose, unwavering. She said, "Enough is right. Enough of erasure. Enough of silence. Enough of being small for your comfort." Her words struck like hammer blows, each syllable louder than the last. David finally spoke, his voice carrying quiet steel. David said, "She's right. We've all seen it. We just lack the courage to say it." The ripple of his words spread like sparks catching flame. For the first time, Emma realized she wasn't alone. Her rage was no longer just hers, it was a voice for every silenced breath in that room. Emma's voice cut through the silence like a blade. She said, "This is my voice, this is my fire, and no one will bury it again." The manager's authority cracked, the room frozen as every eye turned to her. David smirked with pride, while John slumped in guilt. Emma drew a deep breath, whispering, "I will not be erased. Not now, not ever." The words didn't just fill the room, they filled her. For the first time she felt whole, transformed by her own fire. The office felt different the next morning, the air thick with unspoken tension after Emma's defiance. She walked in, her stride steady, her chin lifted higher than ever before. Co-workers glanced up, some with awe, others with discomfort, as if seeing her for the first time. She whispered to herself, "I will not shrink." She placed her folder squarely on the desk, every movement deliberate, every sound intentional. David passed by, his eyes meeting hers with the faintest smile, his approval wordless yet thunderous. He said softly, "You've changed everything." She let the words settle, not as flattery, but as truth earned in fire. Emma muttered, "No, I've just stopped letting them change me." Her reflection in the monitor gleamed back, not invisible, not erased, but whole. The silence around her was no longer suffocating. It was space she had claimed. Emma found herself at the break room table later that morning, the same place where whispers once cut through her silence. Now the room was quieter, the eyes of others tracing her movements with curiosity. She sipped her coffee, calm, deliberate, her voice steady as she muttered, "They don't decide my worth." David leaned against the counter, his smirk more pronounced this time, his tone carrying playful sharpness. David said, "Took you long enough." She laughed faintly, the sound surprising even herself, soft but laced with defiance. Emma said, "Better late than never." The words hung in the air, a declaration that silence no longer defined her. The hum of the vending machine, the clink of mugs, and the quiet shuffle of co-workers all seemed less threatening, less sharp. For the first time the break room wasn't a cage, it was a stage she had finally claimed. That afternoon, Emma stood by the tall office windows, the city stretching endlessly beyond. The sky was clear, no storms, just golden sunlight bathing the skyline. She pressed her hand against the glass, but unlike before, she didn't feel fragile. She whispered, "This is my beginning." John passed by quietly, his shoulders heavy, his eyes lowered, the guilt still etched deep in his posture. He stopped, hesitated, then said, "Emma, I'm sorry." She turned, her face calm but unyielding, her voice sharp but steady. Emma said, "I don't need your apology. I need you to never bury another voice again." His lips parted, but no words came. He nodded once, defeated but listening. She turned back to the city, her reflection shining stronger than it ever had. For the first time, she saw herself not as a ghost, but as fire. As evening fell, Emma walked through the streets where her journey began, the storm replaced by clear skies and neon lights glowing steady against the wet pavement. She whispered, "I was never weak. I was waiting for my fire." Her footsteps echoed with rhythm, not hesitation. The same streets that once mocked her now reflected her strength in every puddle, every window. A passerby brushed against her shoulder, but she didn't shrink, she held her ground, her head high. David appeared beside her, umbrella in hand, walking at her pace, his silence a show of solidarity. He said, So what now? She smirked, her eyes gleaming with the fire of a woman reborn. Emma said, now, I live loud. The city's hum surrounded them, but for once, she felt louder than it all. Emma stood at the city's edge, the wind brushing her hair as if bowing to her strength. She whispered, I will not be erased. Her voice carried into the night, softer than thunder, but stronger than silence. Every dismissal and betrayal no longer chained her, they had forged her. She said, this is not an end. This is who I am now. The city glowed beneath her, endless and alive, but she no longer feared its indifference. Turning away from the skyline, her steps were steady, her fire undeniable. She whispered once more, I forgive myself for being silent. It was not weakness, it was release. And with that, her story closed not with rage but with freedom.